Well, since we're running a little behind, not too much, but a little in this class this semester, I wanted to make sure that we were going to be able to get through everything. And so a good way to do that would be having a video lecture, one video lecture for everybody to look at over the Thanksgiving break, since we have a week without classes. So that's what this lecture is going to be. First of all, finishing up the last little bit on bacteria, and then secondly, getting into this next kingdom that we're going to be spending the rest of the semester on, basically, which is animals. So there's a lot of interest in that since we're animals and people love animals. So to begin with, in terms of bacteria, I mentioned that bacteria have some important ecological roles, especially in terms of nitrogen cycling. They're really, really important in terms of nitrogen, that one element. Different forms of nitrogen make their way through bacteria. There's ammonia, that's one form of nitrogen. There's elemental nitrogen, N2, that's in the gas in the atmosphere. There's nitrates and nitrites, NO3 and NO4, that are in the soil. So there's a number of different types of bacteria that cycle nitrogen. And the point that I made was that there's nitrogen in every nucleic acid, RNA, DNA, ATP. There's nitrogen in every amino acid and every protein. Where does this nitrogen come from? It comes from our food, and in order to get that, there's got to be some mechanism for getting nitrogen out of the soil and dead things, decaying things, decomposing things. Bacteria does that. There's got to be some way of getting nitrogen out of the air into some organic form in a living thing, and bacteria does that. So a very important role, especially in nitrogen. And then as we looked at with viruses, in terms of interactions with humans, there's a lot of good things about bacteria, there's a lot of bad things about bacteria. So first of all, there's some negative things about bacteria. Bacteria is associated with Lyme disease. It may not be the only cause, but it's associated with Lyme disease. Tetanus, E. coli that's killed people, botulism that's killed people, things you have to look out for. Some places, big cholera epidemics. It's not as much of a problem as it used to be, but even still, there's a lot of people that are killed by cholera outbreaks because of the unsanitary water conditions, especially. And it wasn't that long ago that cholera outbreaks all around the world were really common. Now, with antibiotics and the knowledge about what is causing these outbreaks and some steps to avoid the buildup of water the same way so that those outbreaks can occur. But even recently, there's been thousands of people killed by cholera outbreaks, different places, especially after some kind of natural disaster. Gonorrhea, tuberculosis, all associated with bacteria. Those are negative things. In terms of positive things, I mentioned there's a lot of things that die, fall to the ground, sink to the bottom of the ocean or the lake, whatever, and then they're full of organic matter. You know, just a second ago they're alive, then they're dead. They've still got the same components in them. It's a lot of energy, a lot of nutrients that's available, but only for certain types of organisms that are decomposers. So they can decompose a dead, decaying, rotting body and then recycle those nutrients. One of the most important ones is nitrogen. And so if you skip down to the fourth one, nitrogen fixation in the soil, there's all these nodules that are associated with roots of plants, and they can take nitrogen out of the soil and incorporate it into the bacteria. There's other bacteria that can take it out of the water, can take it out of the air. A lot of recycling of nitrogen. And then above that, there's different foods that rely on bacteria. Some people like these, some people really don't like them. But sauerkraut, pickles, buttermilk, yogurt, antibiotics. You know, the original source of antibiotics, penicillin, was bacteria. And there's new strains of antibiotics that are being developed all the time, especially to deal with the ability of bacteria to evolve quickly and develop antibiotic resistant properties. Genetic engineering is commonly uses bacteria as ways of making a whole bunch of copies of things, using the genetic capabilities of bacteria for genetic engineering. The whole CRISPR thing was based on bacteria. Sewage treatment, we rely quite a bit on bacteria, that nitrogen cycle involvement that bacteria have. There's some bacteria that break down this form nitrogen and another form. And again, in sewage, there's a lot of nitrogen, amongst other things, and that nitrogen can be broken down by bacteria. Not by other things, but by bacteria. So there's different sewage treatment steps that involve different types of bacteria. Even on your aquarium filter, sometimes there's bacteria element that filters out some things in terms of the gases, nitrogenous gases that are produced. And then finally, oil spills. Oil spills, oil floats. It really hasn't come to fruition yet, but there's developments of these bacteria that can eat oil, basically decompose oil. So it's still a ways off, but there's promise. You've got some big giant oil spill, these giant natural catastrophes, unnatural man-made catastrophes, human-made, that you could take these bacteria out there and sprinkle them around in these oil spills, and they would digest the oil and make it so that it's not a problem. So those are a number of different uses. There's some ways. You guys are probably mostly too young to remember, but it wasn't that long ago, 2001, 17 years ago, where there was this big anthrax scare. There were these envelopes that were being mailed around to different people. A couple of people died of anthrax, including somebody in Connecticut. And this is a bacteria, and there was this hysteria going around. These few companies that made an antibiotic that would work against anthrax. They were making a lot of money, and people were trying to get this antibiotic, and there was a big scare. The reality of it was just a very small scale, but it certainly got a lot of people's attention. But this anthrax has been around for a long time. Out west, around livestock especially, people are familiar with anthrax, and people get anthrax occasionally. These days, you can, in the small number of cases where it takes place, you can be treated with antibiotics. But it was as a potential biological weapon, anthrax has gotten a lot of attention lately. That's a bacillus. Remember the shapes of bacteria that are used to classify them. Closer to home, you've got this sushi, you've got different Jack in the Box restaurant and Chipotle restaurant that had big outbreaks of bacteria poisoning, food poisoning, making people sick, sometimes killing people. And in Rhode Island, there was the town of Johnston one time had to boil the water because there was a certain bacteria count in the water. On campus at URI about 10 or 15 years ago, there was a problem with the water, and the university was giving out a whole bunch of bottled water because they didn't want the students drinking the water on campus. And then, look, here's a Rhode Island firefighter lost his hand to flesh-eating bacteria. All right. So that's a very quick coverage of bacteria. Part of this topic was to reinforce this idea that we're looking at living things, and these living things have different requirements. They have different characteristics of life, and there's different ways that they go about meeting those requirements. These bacteria are very simple compared to eukaryotic cells, and yet they're very successful, and they're able to meet the challenges of staying alive, acquiring energy, evolving, and growth and reproduction, those characteristics of living things, even in these really simple organisms. And the second point is that they're very successful And then the third point is that there's both good and bad interactions with humans. Okay, so those topics up through bacteria, that is what's going to be on exam 4 on Wednesday when we come back from Thanksgiving. I'm going to start talking about animals. That is the last section of this course. The last little bit of this course is all about animals. So this is a good place to draw the line in your notes, however you're keeping track of this material, and say, okay, these are the topics that exam 4 is going to cover. Viruses, bacteria, the last two. And then we're going to move on to animals, starting with how animals are organized. So now we're going to skip ahead to a fairly complex group of organisms, animals. They've got multiple cells, they're multicellular. They don't just have a bunch of cells together, but these cells are organized together as tissues. These tissues are organized together as organs. The organs are organized together as systems, like your respiratory system, for example. And those are all grouped together into an organism. So it's a much more sophisticated, complex level of organization compared to bacteria that we just looked at. And yet, what we're going to focus on is how animals meet those requirements of life. How do animals reproduce and evolve? And that's a lot of what we've been looking at so far in this class, but this is going to be on a bigger scale. So we're going to start looking at different types of animal tissues that carry out different functions. They have different characteristics. There's 4 different types of tissues that are used for different functions that you find in animals. Pretty advanced compared to a lot of things in between bacteria and animals. And as I said, these tissues are grouped together to form organs. Organs are grouped together to form systems. And the systems make up an individual. And then the last thing is homeostasis, this idea of maintaining a constant, oh no, don't tell me. Okay, here's the slide that was supposed to be there. That there's these 4 different types of tissues. Tissues are groups of cells that carry out a similar function or the same function. So you've got a group of cells that have a certain shape, a certain size, certain characteristics, certain DNA within them that's been expressed, and they carry out these different functions. Of all the different, hundreds of different types of cells in humans and a lot of animals, there are only 4 different types of tissues, but these tissues are very different from one another in terms of their structure, and they're different from one another in terms of their function. So we're going to look at these 4 different tissue types. That's going to take up most of the time of this lecture. So first of all, there's this type of tissue made up of these types of cells called epithelial tissue, epithelial cells. And where you find these in bodies is usually someplace where there's some kind of a connection with the outside of their body. That could be their skin, that's obviously on the outside of their body, but it could be lining a tube in your respiratory system. Now you breathe in air, that's inviting these air inside from the external environment. So a tube is usually lined with epithelial tissue, whether you're talking about the respiratory system or reproductive system or excretory system or the digestive system, all lined with epithelial tissue. It's usually some kind of interface between the animal and the environment, even if it's a tube that runs through the body. And there's also a lot of epithelial tissue that covers things, covers organs, separates parts of the body cavities. And the functions that these organs or these epithelial tissues carry out is they tend to secrete substances. They line things where acid is being secreted or some enzyme is being secreted. They move things, for instance, ovaries, or move it along through the oviducts. They tend to not just secrete things, but they absorb substances. These are thin cells, and remember the location of these epithelial cells is between the organism and the external environment somehow. Even if that's in your stomach or even if that's in your lungs, there's still a connection with the outside world. And then there's a few epithelial tissues, not very many. Most sensory receptors are nerve cells, but there's some that are sensory receptors, specialized epithelial cells. So these epithelial cells come in different shapes. They could be flat, squamous cells. They could be cuboidal, cube-shaped, or they could be shaped like a column, tall and narrow. Those are the three main shapes that they come in. So that's one thing. So let's look at each type of these cells. Squamous epithelial tissue is flat. If you look at the picture on the right, if you look at this diagram, or it's an actual micrograph taken with a microscope, there's these flat cells. The distance from one side of the cell to the other is not very far. So these types of cells work very well for getting substances in and out of an organism, for instance. Across that cell is a tiny little distance. So you can diffuse things like gases quickly, you can absorb things, you can secrete things. So where do you find these? They're involved in filtration, diffusion, those kind of functions. They line blood vessels, they line the alveoli of lungs, they line the kidneys, where blood is filtered and gases are being exchanged. They're thin, tiny little layers that separate the inside of this organism with the outside of the organism. Those are squamous cells, flat cells. There's cuboidal cells, where you can imagine if you're moving something in and out of an organism through these cells, it's going to take longer than squamous cells because they're thicker. So where do you find these? Some things are absorbed into these cells, not necessarily across these cells right into the blood, but into these cells for distribution throughout the organism. Or another common function is where things are secreted, especially the lining of the digestive tract, different glands, kidneys. There's substances that are secreted and absorbed as fluid is moving through the kidneys, and urine is being modified before it leaves the body. So that's another type, is cuboidal cells. And then if you look at these columnar cells, long and skinny, look like a column. Now here, in order to get substances through these epithelial cells all the way to the inside of the organism, that's a long distance compared to those squamous cells. So again, there's secretion of substances that are produced in these cells and secreted into the intestine, for instance. And a lot of the times they have these little finger-like projections on the top. In this picture, that's just all flat on the top, but there'd be little finger-like projections that increase the surface area. They might even move sometimes. So where do you find these long things, long skinny type of epithelial tissue is where things are being secreted, like in the stomach and the intestines, and some things being absorbed. Now another characteristic of these cells is that most of the time you just don't find one layer of cells. These cells come in multiple layers. So it's another characteristic of epithelial cells is what kind of layering there is. So if you look at the epithelial cells, you find some that it's just one layer. Those are called simple squamous cells, simple cuboidal cells, simple columnar cells. It's just one layer of cells. But quite often you find these layers, they're stratified, which means there's layers of them. Sometimes you find a bunch of squamous cells that are laying on top of each other. Sometimes you find cuboidal cells sometimes you find columnar cells that are laying on top of each other. And sometimes you find different types of epithelial tissues, where you might have squamous cells on top of cuboidal cells. So there's a number of different possibilities. There's the cell type based on its shape, and then there's whether these cells are layered, form layers, simple or stratified. So there's a lot of epithelial tissue, carries out some really important functions. Another very versatile type of tissue is connective tissue. Connective tissue is well represented in the body of animals. And the characteristic of the connective tissue there's a number of different types of connective tissues, as we'll see. And as you can see down here, these 6 types. Well, basically what they are is like a background with cells in them. The background is usually protein of some kind. It doesn't have to be, but it's usually some kind of protein made up with protein filaments. There's different protein fibers that run through this matrix. And then you've got a bunch of cells in it. So it's kind of like there's a background with cells that are embedded in this tissue. And then you've got protein filaments, different types of protein filaments that carry out different functions. So these protein fibers, some of the common ones are collagen that you find in different type of connective tissue around the body. This collagen is important. You can get collagen injections for different cosmetic things. That's a type of protein in connective tissue that is supposed to stretch. It stretches and then rebounds and takes its original shape. That's where you tend to find another type of protein, elastin. And as the name implies, elastin, elastic, it's stretchable. So you find that in things that stretch out, they contract and they relax, and so there's something moving through and they stretch out and then they revert back to their original shape, those kind of locations. So there's these 6 types of connective tissue that are listed below here. Let's look at each one of those. Loose connective tissue, as the name implies, there's not very many protein filaments. It's not a very densely packed type of connective tissue. So you find this between organs for the most part. It's not holding anything really, really rigidly in place, but it's coating around them. It's anchoring them in place, but they still got to be able to move quite a bit, and it's got to be fairly flexible around organs. Then you find dense connective tissue, where the matrix, again, is these protein fibers, a whole bunch of protein fibers, like collagen and elastin, things that stretch, but it's very rigid structurally. And embedded in that matrix of protein filaments is cells. So that's dense connective tissue. We find that in tendons and ligaments. There's adipose tissue, which the matrix is basically fat or lipid. There's these lipid droplets, and then in amongst the lipid droplets is cells. So there's different types of cells that are embedded in this matrix. In this case, the matrix isn't protein filaments, but the matrix is a whole bunch of lipid. Now, adipose tissue is great for storing energy. There's twice as many calories in fat as there is in protein or carbohydrate. So it's very good storing its as energy. It cushions and protects a lot of organs, and it's a very good insulator as well. It doesn't conduct heat very much. And then you might not think of blood as being a connective tissue or even being a tissue, but blood meets the definition of connective tissue, where you've got a matrix. In this case, the matrix is water, basically, or plasma. It's got a bunch of protein, but it's got a whole bunch of other things. And in that fluid, what's in blood? Of course, there's cells. There's red blood cells, there's white blood cells, and there's platelets, which are cell fragments. So it's a matrix, not of protein filaments or lipid, but it's a matrix of fluid. And in that fluid, you've got a number of different types of cells. So it really meets the technical definition of connective tissue, even though if you ask most people, is blood a tissue? They'd say, what are you talking about? All right, 2 more that you're also very familiar with. One is cartilage, where the protein is collagen, and there's other proteins, there's other carbohydrates as well. It's a pretty dense type of connective tissue. There's these special types of cells that are embedded in the matrix. It's flexible, though. It's not rigid like bone. And so where do you find this? In our bodies, in your nose, in your kneecaps when you're younger, your ears, places that are flexible. It's important to not have rigid things could be broken off. You can imagine what would happen to our ears and nose all the time if they weren't as flexible as they are. Our sternum, your breastplate is also has cartilage around it. And the bones of some animals, like sharks, are completely cartilage. Then there's another type of connective tissue, bone, that you're all familiar with. Bone is a type of, it's calcified, but it's got the protein in it. It's got nerves and it's got blood vessels and it's got cells in it. So it's got cells in this matrix of this calcified collagen. It's mineralized with calcium. It's a type of connective tissue. All right, then muscle tissue, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on, but it's obviously very important for movement and survival, a lot of different organisms, this muscle tissue. There's different types of muscle tissue, but these cells in the muscle tissue have certain characteristics. They're long and they have these protein filaments embedded in them. There's two main types of protein filaments and they slide past one another as the muscle gets shorter or as the muscle relaxes and gets longer. And as the muscle gets shorter, it pulls on a bone and it moves the bone. So if you're raising your arm, if you're moving your finger back and forth, that's from a muscle contracting and pulling on a bone. And as you can imagine, in humans, in the human body, we've got a lot of muscle. It's very dense. It's got a lot of ATP. It's got a lot of mitochondria. It uses a lot of energy. It's important for us to move around. It's important for our evolution, survival. So there's a lot of muscle tissue, and it uses a lot of energy, a lot of oxygen, a lot of ATP is used in just these muscles contracting. So if you look at an animal like us, for instance, there's three different types of tissue. There's skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. They're found in different locations, and they carry out different functions, but they operate in a very similar way. So if you take in human anatomy and physiology, then you'll go into a lot more detail about all kinds of things about muscles and muscle contraction, as well as bones. You're going to have to memorize all these different bones and all these different muscles, and a number of different nerves, which brings us to this next type of tissue, nervous tissue. A nervous tissue is made up of these special types of cells, basically two different types of cells. There's neurons, and then there's these supporting cells. And those supporting cells form different types of structures around the nerve cells. So most of you have probably seen a nerve cell. If you recognize this cell, if you looked at this cell with its dendrites and its axons, you'd probably recognize that as a nerve cell. And these nerve cells, individual cells, are connected to one another. And there's a nerve impulse. It's basically electricity. It's electrons that are moving along the length of this axon from one nerve cell to another. Happens very quickly, and then in between the nerve cells there's chemicals that are released. But basically, if you have some stimulus, like somebody took a pen and stuck your finger, then you'd feel that. It would go to your brain very quickly along one nerve after another, a nerve cell after another nerve cell after another nerve cell. As these nerve cells are bundled together, that's what makes up a nerve, along with some other support materials. But somebody could take a lighter and hold it underneath your finger, and very quickly that message would make it from your finger all the way to your brain and all the way back to the muscles around your finger, and you'd pull your finger back because it's hot. These nerve impulses travel very, very quickly. Part of what makes them travel as quickly as they do are these supporting cells, these Schwann cells, and the myelin sheath that surrounds the axons. It speeds up the rate at which the nerve impulses travel. So they're obviously very important. nerve cells for the success of animals and the survival of animals. So that's a quick run through of the different type of tissues that you find in animals. Now let's put all these tissues together in organs, and then we'll put those organs together in systems. And then if you took all those systems and put them together, reproductive system, circulatory system, integumentary system, immune system, endocrine system, all those different systems, that makes up an organism. Well, you're all familiar with a number of different organs in the body, your kidney and your heart and your lung and your brain. There's these different organs. If you looked at any one of these, this example here is the stomach. So you'd find the same thing if you looked at the liver or some other organ as well. But what you find in one of these organs is that there's all four of these tissues are found in an organ. There's some type of epithelial tissue that's a lot of times for absorption or secretion or the transfer of something from outside the body in. There's connective tissue that's more supporting and somewhat protective. There's muscle tissue that can move things, that can either voluntarily move things or involuntarily move things. Smooth muscle is involuntary, and skeletal muscle you have voluntary control over. There's also cardiac muscle that is a special type of muscle cell that allows all those cells to be coordinated, so your heart beats as one rather than all these different cells doing their own thing. And then you have nervous tissue as well. If you looked at your stomach, there's nerves that innervate your stomach. If you looked at your intestine, there's nerves there. If you looked at your heart, there's nerves there. All these different organs have all four of those tissues. And here's a list of the different types of systems that organs make up. There's the excretory system, there's the circulatory system, there's the respiratory system. If you look at these, the digestive system, where we have this example here, you're all familiar with different parts of the digestive system. We've got an esophagus, we've got a stomach, we've got a small intestine, we've got a large intestine. The pancreas is related to digestion. The liver has a role in digestion. And so each one of these systems is made up of a number of organs. If you look at the endocrine system, there's a number of different glands that secrete different types of hormones. So this is what all these tissues make up, or organs, and all these organs make up these systems. And then, as I said, these systems make up a whole organism. All right, the last thing that I want to talk about today, and then we'll probably finish. This lecture won't quite be 50 minutes, so you'd be a little disappointed that it's not that long, but is homeostasis. If you look at all these different reactions that we've looked at, all these different biochemical reactions that we've looked at inside of cells, all these different things that are going on inside of cells in terms of energetics and DNA and RNA and protein synthesis and gene expression, there's a lot of things that take place inside of an organism that are sensitive to environmental changes, especially with enzymes. Enzymes are especially sensitive to change. So it makes sense if you've got all these enzymes that are involved in all these reactions inside of a body, inside of a cell specifically, that the more constant the environment is, the better off you're going to be in terms of these biochemical reactions taking place, in terms of the enzymes functioning the way they're supposed to. And the more this internal system deviates from some set point, then the harder it is going to be for that cell to work the way it's supposed to be, for those enzymes to function the way they're supposed to be. So there's this idea of homeostasis, that if you look at the internal environment of most organisms, they go to a lot of trouble, they expend a lot of energy. A lot of those systems that we just looked at are geared towards maintaining a constant internal environment for all these processes to take place. And so if you look at an organism, this organism is being compared to a lunch pail or whatever this is, briefcase, some kind of case with a handle. where you've got all these epithelial cells on the outside, and you've got these tubes basically running through this organism, with the digestive system and the respiratory system is tubes going into our lungs, in our case. Circulatory systems, all these tubes that are blood vessels. The urinary system or excretory system has tubes that run from our kidneys to our bladder and out of our bodies when we're creating urine. So these different systems, the respiratory system, the circulatory system, digestive system, urinary system, all of those are related to maintaining homeostasis. And those are, for each one of those systems, it's one of the main functions that they carry out is maintaining homeostasis. So this idea of homeostasis it operates for the most part based on negative feedback. So negative feedback works by having a set point. So the example here is cruise control. The set point, you guys are all responsible drivers. Don't speed. I see some people speeding past me when I'm driving down here in the morning. They're probably going to some other school. So you set your cruise control at 55 miles an hour. When you're going down a hill and there's less gas given to your engine, slows you down so you stay at 55 miles an hour. If you're going up a hill, your engine's giving more gas. The speed remains the same at 55 miles an hour, but the negative feedback works by when you start going down the hill, you start speeding up. So you're going 56, 57, 58. Then the negative feedback kicks in, and the engine is given less energy. Same thing with the furnace in your house. You set your furnace to 70 degrees, your thermostat. And when it gets below 70 degrees, a certain temperature, then the furnace turns on and heats your house back up to 70 degrees. When it gets above 70 degrees, maybe you have a heating cooling system, you get to a certain temperature, and then the air conditioner is going to turn on and bring that temperature back down to 70 degrees. It's negative feedback when it deviates from whatever the set point is in terms of temperature, pH, the amount of oxygen, the amount of carbon dioxide, whatever it is that the organism is measuring or keeping track of. When it deviates from some comfort level, then something kicks in. Could be the respiratory system, it could be the circulatory system, it could be the excretory system, could be a number of systems combined that bring this parameter, whatever it is, pH or the amount of oxygen, back to the normal range. So here's an example that we can all relate to, especially as it gets colder and colder and snows and we get into the New England winter, is heat. We are warm-blooded, we're warm-bodied, and we maintain our body temperature 37 degrees Celsius, 98.6 degrees. That's the normal temperature of humans. When we get cold, then there's a number of different things that happen. We start to shiver, our metabolic rate goes up, we get goosebumps. There's things that increase our body heat and bring it back up to 98.6 degrees. When we get a fever, what do? You get chills sometimes, you start sweating. And so a fever is when your body's getting off in terms of the normal body temperature. It's your body reacting to some invader in an attempt to decrease the ability of a virus or a bacteria to survive by raising our temperature. But you start sweating, you bring your body temperature back down a little. So if you look at all the different types of animals out there, some are cold-blooded. They don't keep a constant body temperature. Those are ectotherms, where if they're going to heat their body at all, it's from the external environment. So they go up and they bask in the sun and warm up their bodies, or they huddle together, or they burrow into the dirt or into the ground or something like that. Their body temperature is going to change depending on how warm or how cold it is. Then you have ectotherms, warm-blooded, warm-bodied, where metabolic heat, this process of burning food, is inefficient. There's loss. One of the losses is heat. So these warm-blooded animals, birds and mammals, basically, they retain heat and they have a metabolic rate that's high enough to generate enough heat to keep their body at a constant temperature. That's why our temperature is the same. We go to a lot of trouble, expend a lot of energy to heat our bodies to a certain temperature. We'll talk about why that came about theoretically. So that's birds and mammals. The cold-blooded ectotherms are things, obviously, fish, invertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, those type of fish, those type of organisms, rather. So here's an example. There's a bobcat and there's a snake. An ectotherm, the snake, and an endotherm, the bobcat. If you look at the outside temperature, the temperature in the air, in this figure, it shows a range of temperatures of about 5 degrees Celsius, which is pretty cold, up to almost 40 degrees Celsius. That's the air temperature. So it goes from cold to pretty hot. And if you look at the body temperature of the snake, as it gets warmer, the air gets warmer, then the snake gets warmer. As the air gets colder, the snake's body temperature gets colder. And it might get to the point where they're very inactive, very down there at very cold temperatures. Then there's the temperature of the bobcat. There's a huge temperature range throughout which the bobcat's body temperature is the same. It's always about a little less than 40 degrees, similar to ours. Maybe at the extremes, when it's really cold, the bobcat might have a hard time maintaining a constant temperature. When it's really hot, the bobcat might have a hard time. But throughout this pretty wide range, from 5 to over 35, 40 degrees, this bobcat can maintain a constant temperature. That is an endotherm versus an ectotherm snake. So if we look at humans, look at ourselves, we can tolerate a very narrow range of temperatures between about 97 and 100 degrees. That's okay. We can tolerate those without too much going wrong. But if our body temperature drops down to below 97 degrees and gets down to 95 degrees, that's when you start having hypothermia and you have these conditions. It's not a very good physiological state to be in. You can become disoriented and lost and injured and all kinds of different things if you're experiencing that out in the wild. And then if you think about the other side, if it's too hot, you have too high of a temperature, you take aspirin to lower your body temperature. They put you in an ice bath sometimes to lower your temperature, because once you get to 105 degrees or so, then these cells start to get damaged. You can have proteins that start to become denatured at these high temperatures. So we have a very narrow temperature range. And again, we go to a lot of trouble to cool ourselves down when we get too hot. We go to a lot of trouble to warm ourselves up when it gets too warm. And this is the case for most animals. They've got a narrow temperature range. Not narrow like that unless they're warm-blooded, warm-bodied like mammals and birds. But even ectotherms have a relatively narrow range of, they're not going to really tolerate that 5 degrees to 40 degrees like we saw in that one figure. So in endotherms, like us, warm-bodied animals, it's energetically expensive, like I said. It takes a lot of energy. So why go to all the trouble? Well, the benefit is you can be big, you can be very active. If you're warm, your muscles are contracting at a high rate, your muscles are contracting more powerfully, so you're processing sensory information very quickly. So you're really doing things quickly, you're sensing things quickly, you're responding to the environment quickly. You've got a huge advantage over these cold, slow things that are doing things in slow motion. So basically you can be bigger, faster, and have a big advantage over cold-blooded animals. Well, the cost is, one, you need more food. It's metabolically expensive, so you need more energy. Another one is it uses a lot of water, so you need more water. Another one, this metabolic rate to supply just activity takes up a lot of your energy. That means less energy is available for growth and reproduction. So in some of these warm-blooded animals, they don't grow and reproduce very quickly. So what do you do to keep your body temperature constant if it's that important to your survival? 1, you can generate more heat. 2, you can reduce the amount of heat that you lose. Those are 2 different approaches. And there's a number of different ways. Generating more heat is basically metabolically, your metabolic rate goes up. But reducing your heat loss, you can change your posture, you can change your level of activity. You can be active during the day, but not during the night. You can crawl into a hole, you can have fur, you can have blubber, there's a number of different ways that you can reduce heat loss. Generating more heat, pretty much your metabolic rate goes up. And in terms of why would you be warm-blooded in the first place if it's so expensive? Granted, it has an advantage. If you're warm-blooded, you can do things that cold-blooded animals don't. But the thought is, this is the theory anyway, if you look at cats and you look at birds and you look at humans and you look at chimpanzees and leopards and all these warm-blooded animals, their body temperature all tends to be about 37 degrees. That's the set point, a little less than 40 degrees. So the thought is that when they evolved, when they were on land and they were evolving, the earth was pretty warm. And the temperatures that these animals were experiencing was about 37 degrees. So at 37 degrees, that's when they spent millions of years with their body temperatures about 37 degrees, because that was the environmental temperature that was around that. And so after millions of years, they had all these enzymes that functioned optimally at what temperature? At 37 degrees. Below 37 degrees, these enzymes didn't work as well. Above 37 degrees, these enzymes didn't work very well. And they were optimally active within a narrow range of temperatures. Then the Earth started to cool. There were ice ages, and a lot of these warm-blooded animals, a lot of these animals that were very well adapted to 37 degrees, they started experiencing cold temperatures. And then their choices were either to develop new enzymes that worked at colder temperatures. Now that takes millions of years, and that is evolution, and if you don't have the genes to do that, you just can't do that. Or you can have adaptations for maintaining a constant body temperature. And so the change that takes place evolutionarily is that your body is kept at a constant temperature. And there's a lot of evolution that has to go into that, but it doesn't involve developing a whole bunch of enzymes that will work at temperatures other than 37 degrees. You can keep all those enzymes, all those genes that are used to express proteins that are enzymes, they're all fine if you keep your body temperature constant. So that's the thought of how body temperature of warm-blooded animals came to be about 37 degrees and how warm-bloodedness came about in the first place. Okay, well, that is about 48 minutes for this lecture. And that is going to be the video lecture that you have over Thanksgiving. So it's a very interesting topic, I think, this idea of homeostasis. And it's also something we can all relate to, these different types of tissues and organs and systems that we have, because we all have those. And it's something that you guys are familiar with to a certain degree. So that is this lecture, and then when we come back on Monday after Thanksgiving, we'll start right up into these different types of animals.